The Tom Woods Show, episode 750.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hello, everybody. Tom Woods here, back from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I had a tremendous weekend with the Mises Institute. I'll tell you a little bit about that after the main thrust of the episode is over. What I'm doing today is something a little different in that it's a topic I haven't hit on all that much recently, but I'd like to revisit because it is, it is a theme, it is a topic that is associated with me, and because I have a lot of new listeners who may not have listened to every episode in the Tom Woods Show catalog, and that means it couldn't hurt to have a bit of a refresher. What I'm sharing with you today is a talk I gave in 2012 at the meeting of the CSPOA, which is the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which is run by Sheriff Richard Mack. And he asked me to come out to their conference in Las Vegas and speak to the sheriffs in the room. There are about 100 or so sheriffs in the room. Talk to them about state nullification of unconstitutional federal laws. Obviously, I have a little bit of association with that cause, given that I wrote a book called Nullification in 2012. I'll link to that for you at tomwoods.com/751. I beg your pardon, 750. This is, I'm really happy with that book because I think it makes a really strong case, because the case is strong. The case for state nullification, the constitutional case, strategic, moral, historical, you can make the case from all different angles. And I do it in that book. And through the Audible offer, you can also get the audiobook version of Nullification for free through tomwoodsaudio.com. So if you like audiobooks, tomwoodsaudio.com is the link for you. So bear in mind the significance of what you're about to hear is multiplied a bit because it was said before a room of 100 sheriffs, and I brought, I don't remember, it's 4 years ago now, but I must have brought 3 or 4 dozen copies of the book, and they all sold right out. So that was a good thing. I was glad to have been involved in that. So I'm going to play that for you now, and then I have some fun little comments to tell you about my trip to Cambridge and stuff like that. And then the episode for tomorrow is just so heartwarming and great. I can't wait to tell you about that. So let's hurry up and get the episode over with so I can tell you the fun stuff. Here we go. Now, the other speakers knew what it was like to be a little behind schedule. Now, technically, I have like negative 15 minutes for this, but do you need me to wear the lapel mic? If you want to. All right, I will do, and whatever helps. Well, Sheriff Mack, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for me to be here. And Sheriff Mack was talking about all the different things that had to come together for this event to take place. And I'm sorry to say that at least for, 15 minutes of the ordeal, I was part of the problem because Sheriff Mack asked me to come speak, and I had a very busy January. I had a not busy November and December, but I had 5 events in January, and it's a strain on the family because I've got 4 little children, and the oldest is 8, and every time I leave, I leave them behind, and so I said, I just can't. And he said, you've got to be here. Like, whatever I got to do, you got to be here. And I thought, well, this poor guy. Like, I don't want to make him beg. Like, that's just beneath this poor guy, right? He's a dignified. So, all right, I'll go. What the heck? But I can't stay. Unfortunately, I wanted to stay through tomorrow, where all the events for the public are taking place. But I have, in order for me to be back in time, really, for the full birthday party that we're having for one of our kids, I have to leave tomorrow. And that's one of the things I've said. I've never be out of town for a birthday. And I'll just note that I have our eldest daughter, who is 8.5, she's one of these. I know you're sick and tired of hearing people brag about their kids, so I'm not going to dwell on this. However, she's one of these super duper advanced. She's like in the 57th grade sort of thing. And when she was 7, the school just finally said, all right, obviously she's reading at some zillionth grade level, so we'll show this kid. They gave her Little Women, which is like this thick. So she read the whole thing, and they quizzed her and tested her, and she got all of it right, and she remembered it, and there's no problem. Well, right around that time, she was really starting to ask her father, what are your books about? Like, what is in Daddy's books? I read all these other books, I know all about Daffy Duck and everything else. Now, what's in your books? And I would say to her, well, I'd love to share this with you, and I can't wait for you to get a little older, and we can share this together. It'll be great. Oh, she's just not accepting this at all. No, explain it to me, and I'll understand. Well, finally, after she read Little Women, she more or less came to me and very gently and more or less diplomatically said to me, look, Dad, I just read Little Women. I mean, how hard could nullification be? So I sat down with her and I thought, I'm going to try to explain this. Because the thing is, she is sort of politically aware, just through osmosis, just listening to her father, blah, 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 to her mother all the time. And so, for example, this is not, I don't have to make it, in my household, I don't have to make up stories, right? We have perfectly spontaneous things occurring all the time. And one of them was, not long ago, somebody knocked on the door, my wife answered it, and by the time our daughter Regina came in to find out who it was already gone, and she said to my wife, who was that at the door? My wife said, oh, it was somebody asking for money. And I kid you not, our daughter Regina said, don't tell me the IRS was at the door. Like, how would she think? I don't know. Well, what I do for a living, basically, is I become a myth buster. And sometimes I say, I would like to pump gas for a living. I'd like to live in a society where I don't have any myths to debunk, where people are taught real American history, where we're not taught a lot of phony baloney nonsense. I'd like to live in that country, and it would be an honor to pump gas in that country. But until we're living in that country, I'm doing this. And I've been writing books for some time, and that's pretty much what I do. How could you write so many books? Well, when you have no social life and you don't sleep, you'd be amazed at what you can accomplish. So 2004, I had this book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. And the response from the New York Times was they were appalled. How dare I say some of the things in that book? But what was revealing is that when the New York Times attacked me for that book, they did so not in the book review section. That would have been flattering enough. They attacked me in a signed editorial on the editorial page, solemnly warning the American public about this book. Copies of which, by the way, are available at my table. And, of course, what do you suppose happened when that attack came out? Of course, sales right through the roof, of course. Because all normal Americans immediately thought, wow, what has got the New York Times all worked up? I've got to get a copy of this book. So ever since then, the New York Times has just ignored me. Like, that's the approach now. Which I have to hand it to them. That's much smarter than what they did before. But that's really what sort of put me on the map. And I realized when that book did so well, I was just some professor somewhere. And up to that point, I'd written books that more or less other professors might buy. And, if you sell 50 copies, you have a big bash. And even though you yourself secretly bought 25 of them just to make it look respectable. So this was just a shot out of the blue. And when I saw how it resonated, I thought, all right, there is a market for that. People are just sick of it. They don't believe what the official opinion molders are telling them. They don't believe what the official information transmission channels are telling them. Well, all right. Well, then I want to keep doing this. And somehow I've kind of made a kind of career out of talking about forbidden things or things they don't want us talking about. And that's what I'm talking about tonight. Is a topic they don't want us talking about. And that's this topic of nullification that you're going to hear talked about a lot more because there are a lot of frustrated Americans. I agree completely that we've got a lot of frustrated Americans, but not just frustrated Americans, but Americans who feel like we've already tried all the other things. Like we've already tried I've written to my congressman. I called up my congressman. I said, I think you're a bum. And, it gives me slight satisfaction, but I'm not seeing results here. What can we do other than this? And suddenly, people are peering into the long-neglected Thomas Jefferson toolkit, and they're looking for things that might work. Now, some of these things, like nullification, I have to warn you, are not approved by the New York Times. And in fact, what I tell you tonight does not fall inside that box that all good Americans are supposed to confine themselves to. We're supposed to be in that box. And you all know it. It goes from Joe Biden to Mitt Romney. You're allowed to be somewhere in there. But if you stray a little bit over here, citizen, be careful. Be careful. You're not respectable. Well, my view is, as I've said repeatedly, that it's our job as good and decent Americans to crush that box into the ground and then set it on fire. So now back to my daughter. I talked to her finally about nullification. I thought, all right, well, look, she's got me, right, with that line about Little Women. What am I going to do? So I explained it to her this way. I said, in the Constitution, which she kind of knew what that was, I said, there's a list. They made a list of things that the government in Washington could do. I didn't say Article 1, Section 8, but it's a list of things. And I kid you not, her first instinct was to ask me, but what if they do something that's not on the list? I said, oh, man, my heart's melting here. That's just beautiful. I said, well, you know what? You're walking right into it, because that's exactly what nullification is. That's when the states say, now, wait a minute, we didn't put this on the list, so we're not doing it. And she got it immediately. So I thought to myself, she was 7 when I explained this to her, I thought, my 7-year-old kid is better than all the Supreme Court justices put together. I can't believe my good fortune to have. Now, I realize I wasn't setting the bar particularly high for my daughter when I did that. But she got it, right? She got this, because it's not that hard to understand. And what she found hard to understand was that anyone would think this was controversial. Well, of course, if they do something not on the list, of course you shouldn't do it. Well, I said to her, look, yeah, I know, look, should be obvious, right? We live in a crazy place, okay? But what your daddy's trying to do is make it obvious again. Because George Orwell once said that it is the duty of honest men, sometimes it devolves upon them, the duty of repeating the obvious. Well, here we are. When you live in an insane, the society we're in, it's a combination between an Orwell novel and a Kafka novel. And when you're in that society, stating the obvious becomes a revolutionary act. So what is this thing? Well, to make a long story extremely short, it basically boils down to this. In 1798, we had some offensive legislation that was signed into law by John Adams called the Alien and Sedition Acts. I will dwell just for a moment only on the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to be critical of the president or the Congress, to be excessively critical. Now, notice they skipped over somebody. They skipped over the vice president, because at that time, the top vote getter becomes the president, the second place finisher becomes the vice president. So John Adams is the president, belonging to the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson's the vice president. He belongs to the Republican Party. The Federalists dominate the executive branch, the Congress, and the courts. So you can't criticize the president or the Congress, but they jump right over Thomas Jefferson, the vice president. You can say anything you want to about him under the law. So Jefferson thought, look, I'm not really that stupid, right? I mean, I see this is obviously a partisan measure designed to hurt my party. And sure enough, influential Republican newspaper editors were being tossed in jail. People making what, by today's standards, are astonishingly restrained comments about John Adams are being fined or imprisoned. There was a U.S. congressman from Vermont who went to jail. This was a guy who had fought in the American Revolution. He was sent to jail for saying something, again, totally harmless about John Adams, although I am happy to report that the $1,000 fine he had to pay was actually paid for by his constituents who took up a collection for him and then proceeded to re-elect him for another term from jail. Say, those are the Americans, okay? Those are the, they are our forefathers. Those are the ones we need to remember and emulate. So Jefferson thought, well, I don't think you can I'm not going to say, look, it was fun having a constitutional government, but all good things must come to an end. I mean, something has to be done about this. What are we going to do? Well, we could wait 2 years for the next presidential election, but again, and I hate to say things that fall outside that box, but once in a while, you notice a presidential election doesn't yield you, the results you might have been looking for. We'll just put it that way. So, and plus, by then we might all be in jail. Like, we can't wait for 2 years. Well, it's ridiculous. Or we could refer this to the Supreme Court, right? Have the Supreme Court look at it. Well, the Supreme Court did not actually hear any cases pertaining to this, but if they had, they would have supported the Sedition Act because all the justices were appointed by Federalists. And in fact, a good number of the states, including my home state of Massachusetts, said that the sedition law was most excellent. It's about time we had this thing to stop all these scurrilous things being said about our wise president. So, good old Massachusetts, screwing up the country for 200 years. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Look, I'm sorry. I come here from Massachusetts. I mean, I don't live in Massachusetts anymore, but boy, do we have a lot to answer for. So I don't want people come to me and say, "Oh, I'm from such and such state, and I'm so sorry that we produce such and such politician," and I just sit there and feel like I can't even say a word. Like, what can I even say to these poor people? So Jefferson. So what are we going to do? So the Supreme Court is not going to work, but even if it would work, in the sense that it might give you the ruling you want, from Jefferson's point of view, the federal government is the problem. The Supreme Court is a branch of the problem. You don't refer a dispute like this between the states and the federal government to the federal government. It would be like you and I are having a dispute, and I say, "Oh, I have just the impartial arbiter for this, my mother." All right, she's a fair-minded, wonderful woman. And I'm not just saying this because I have no idea what YouTube channel this might wind up on someday. But, you know, I wouldn't bet my life that she's going to vote against me. So Jefferson's view was, no, the federal courts are a party to one of the sides. You know, like they're one of the parties in this contest. You can't refer it to them. It doesn't even make sense. No. In this case, the states are the proper disputants, as the states confer among themselves and ask, did we intend to delegate this power to the federal government? Those are the proper disputants. And that was Jefferson's view. That was James Madison's view, as he wrote in the famous report of 1800, sometimes called the Virginia Report. He said, it's not the case, I'm paraphrasing, he said, it's not the case that our presidents are fallible, our congressmen are fallible, but our judges are divine. That's not our system. He says, to the contrary, all three branches can betray us. And so there needs to be a last resort mechanism when we've been betrayed by everybody. And that mechanism consists of the parties to the Constitution themselves, namely the states, having a last resort no. That's what Jefferson called nullification. He introduced that word into the American political vocabulary. Now, when you are attacked and smeared for talking about nullification, I can almost guarantee, it's not an ironclad guarantee, but it's like 90% guarantee that the people attacking you will not dare mention Thomas Jefferson's name. Because they know if people get the idea that Jefferson thought this, maybe it might give them ideas. Well, gee, Jefferson wasn't exactly a slouch. If Jefferson came up with this, maybe we might use this today. So therefore, Jefferson just falls out of the historical picture. No mention of him. But, you know, I like to, just to drive them crazy, I'm just going to say Jefferson, 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 Jefferson. It was his idea. Okay? So I don't care that it's the whole political class and the whole media class and that it's Rachel Maddow and Keith Olbermann, wherever he wound up, and Bill O'Reilly and all of them against Thomas Jefferson and me. I just, you know, it's like me and Wilt Chamberlain scored 102 points together. It's one of those things, you know, Jefferson's doing most of the legwork here. But I still feel like the odds are pretty good, and we got him in our corner. So Jefferson drafts the Kentucky resolutions of 1798. Madison drafts the Virginia resolutions of 1798. And they're basically saying the states have to do this. They're duty-bound, said Madison, duty-bound to interpose between the federal government and the people. He didn't say, well, you know, maybe they might think about interposing, or it might be a good idea if it's a half moon or something. They're duty-bound to interpose. That's strong language. Now, in the year 1998, you would think there would have been a big celebration in Washington commemorating these documents. But you know what? Surprisingly, there was not a word. Not a word. We have to find out about them on our own. Now, where did Thomas Jefferson get this idea from, though? I mean, maybe he was just, you know, maybe we're just taking we're cherry-picking one thing that Jefferson thought, and maybe he was drunk and he woke up hungover and he thought to himself, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't publicize nullification while I was drunk the other night. And then he realized, oh no, it's already been published. It was not that. To the contrary, Jefferson, although he's the one who introduces the word, was really just channeling an idea that goes back at least 10 years earlier to the ratifying convention in Virginia. So the Constitution's drafted in 1787. Then, as you know, it goes out to the states. And there were skeptics in some of those state ratifying conventions. They're skeptical of the Constitution. They think this Constitution is going to grant this federal government all kinds of crazy powers. Because they say, look at all these open-ended phrases in it, like general welfare, or necessary and proper, and so on and so forth. Or even the Supremacy Clause there was some concern about. And what happened in Virginia? Well, first of all, remember, Virginia is a very populous state, very important and influential. So many important statesmen come from Virginia. It matters what's said there. And Patrick Henry said at that ratifying convention, I'm concerned about this Constitution, because that general welfare clause, every tyrant says that all the things he's doing are for the general welfare. We have no guarantee this thing isn't going to commit all kinds of enormities against us. And so Edmund Randolph stood up and said, you don't have anything to worry about, because this is a limited government of enumerated powers, and so no phrase like that can amount to an additional delegation of power. The delegation of power is spelled out clearly. We've got all these things the federal government can do, and he even said that the federal government will have only those powers that are expressly delegated. So he used even stronger language than would be used in the 10th Amendment a little while later. He used expressly delegated. In fact, at least half a dozen ratifying conventions used that phrase, expressly delegated. And what matters when you're interpreting the Constitution is, what did the ratifiers think? That's what Madison said. And that's what Jefferson said. You want to know what the Constitution means, you go and see what its friends said that it meant. Well, what did its friends say that it meant in Virginia? Well, Edmund Randolph said it means that it's got only these powers expressly delegated. Edmund Randolph became first U.S. Attorney General. And then George Nicholas, who became Attorney General of Kentucky, said in the Virginia Ratifying Convention that if the federal government should attempt to impose upon the states any supplementary condition, that is to say, anything over and above what we gave it the power to do in the Constitution, Virginia will be exonerated from it. Well, that's pretty darn close to nullification without using the word. Now, who was George Nicholas, though? I mean, maybe I'm cherry-picking him. Maybe he was some drunk who stumbled into the proceedings. Well, it turns out that not only was he the future Attorney General of Kentucky, but he and Randolph together sat on the 5-man commission whose job it was to draft the ratification instrument of Virginia, the document by which Virginia would enter the Union. So their opinions pretty much are the opinions of Virginia about the significance of their ratification. That they're just ratifying a document with some specified powers in it, and if it tries to exercise some supplementary power, well, Virginia won't have to do it. That's what Jefferson's appealing to 10 years later. Patrick Henry referred to this again in 1790. John Taylor of Caroline in his pamphlets was talking about it all through the 1790s, and it culminates in the great Kentucky resolutions of 1798. Now, sure, you can get the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions maybe mentioned in passing and usually misleadingly in a U.S. history textbook. But the rest of this stuff I just told you, the number of textbooks that mention this, or American history classes in this country that mention this, I mean, to say you can count them on one hand, I mean, you could count them on, like, if I cut off my hand, I could still count them. And no, I wouldn't have to count to one. Let's imagine I've got no hand at all. Right? I mean, none of this stuff. Just nothing. Nothing. So I'll tell you a quick thing about myself. I stink at almost everything. I'm a bad plumber. I'm a bad carpenter. I'm a bad fix-it man. I have no idea how my car works. As far as I know, there's a little angel in there that makes it go. I don't understand anything. The only thing I can do is write history. That's the only thing I can do. That's my contribution to this. That's all I can do. I'm not a strategist. I'm not an organizer. I'm terrible at everything else. My handwriting is bad. I mean, really, I could go on and on. This is the one thing I can do, because I feel like whatever else, whatever other tools we may need to turn things around, one of them is going to be knowledge. And I am not going to let all those rotten books that I had to read through all those years of graduate school go to waste. I'm going to put them to some use and do this stuff. So I decided, when I saw one day that there were some Tea Party groups that were linking to my videos on nullification, but I was giving talks on nullification just because I'm a historian. I talk about old things. They were linking to them because they thought, hey, this sounds pretty good. Why don't we do it now? And I thought in my wildest dreams I never thought anyone would talk like this again. So I wrote a book called Nullification. I thought as soon as you start talking about this, you talk about the states, whatever, you're going to be smeared. They're going to call you names. You probably are racist. Like we've all heard all the usual things you get called, right? I mean, you can't. No one wants to have an actual argument with you because they fear they might lose. So they just try to call you these career-destroying names. Well, I'll tell you, it hasn't destroyed my career. Call me anything you want, but what I have done is I've made myself sort of bulletproof by going through, I mean, it was not easy going through Harvard and Columbia surrounded by dopes constantly who think they're little geniuses, 18-year-old snotballs who have read one article on something and think they're experts on it now. That was tough. So I'm not going to let that go to waste. My intention is I'm going to take their credentials and use them against those institutions and make them regret they ever admitted me to those colleges. So I wanted to do this because I thought if people want to do this, they're going to be called all kinds of names. I want to arm people with the arguments for this because the arguments are overwhelming. Historical arguments, constitutional arguments, strategic arguments, moral arguments, they're all there. But the beautiful thing about it, see, I don't design any of my book covers because that's another thing I stink at. So I was thrilled to see the way they designed the freaking cover because look at it. It's a little bit distant, so I'm going to describe it to you. So we got picture of Obama with Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and Chris Dodd and some others with the word nullification stamped over their heads. So it doesn't matter. The beauty of this on the part of my publishers, it doesn't matter if you know what the concept of nullification is. You take one look at this and you say, whatever this thing is, I like it already. All right, so when you go through and you look at the history, you find that not 10 years later, the New England states are all up in arms. How dare Virginia and Kentucky talk this way about our wise overlords in Washington? How dare they suggest that they might be able to resist something that comes down from them? How dare they? But not 10 years later, the New England states are using the same language. Not 10 years later. So I don't care that in 1798 they weren't on board because actions speak louder than words. And already in 1807, they're chafing under what they consider to be federal oppressions. Whether it's the Jefferson embargo, whether it's unconstitutional searches and seizures, they are appealing to this language. I put in here, I like to put documents sometimes. In this book, I got a lot of documents so that you don't have to take my word for it. One document is a speech by the governor of Connecticut in 1809. Governor of Connecticut. Now, when was the last time we ever thought a governor of Connecticut did anything that we would not cringe to hear about? But here's a Governor Jonathan Trumbull who reminded the legislature that it devolves upon the states in the last resort. When the federal government has usurped powers, it devolves upon the states to be the sentinels of the liberties of the people. Now, a year or two ago, I guess 2 years ago now, there was an election in Connecticut for Attorney General. And the Republican candidate, during the debate, pulls out this book and quotes from Jonathan Trumbull from 200 years ago. She says, you know, we need people in the state right now who will talk like this. Well, they went up one side of her and down the other because she'd committed the unforgivable sin. And I don't mean the unforgivable sin of the Christian tradition because, you know the people we're talking about, these are not exactly the most devout in the world. No, the unforgivable sin is to break out of the Biden to Romney box. And Biden doesn't say nullification is okay, neither does Mitt Romney, so we don't even have to refute you. It's just enough to say you've strayed from the box. They don't refute you. They don't bother. They can't. They have no arguments. Usually what they'll say, what the New York Times has done to me and others, is just to quote and say, look, hey, he says so-and-so. Yep, I do. I do say so-and-so, and I got a lot of proof for that statement, too. Doesn't matter. You've strayed. Well, we have to stray. We have to be proud of being strays. And as history goes on, we see other states making this appeal. In 1820, the legislature of Ohio passes a resolution saying, we believe a majority of Americans have adopted these great principles of 1798. In the 1850s, Wisconsin's Supreme Court cheered what its state legislature had done. What had its state legislature done? It had declared that notwithstanding the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had in many particulars gone beyond what that authorized and was unauthoritative, void, and of no force, and not to be enforced in Wisconsin, and its state Supreme Court cheered that on. Now, again, how often is that talked about? in class, right? Never. I mean, there were handbills passed around in Wisconsin saying, in order to protect these free men, these former slaves, we must appeal to our state sovereignty. Now, isn't that the exact opposite of what we normally hear? Is that state sovereignty is just a cloak for slavery? What? To the contrary, when South Carolina seceded December 20th, 1860, one of its complaints was it was sick and tired of the North doing so much nullifying. When Jefferson Davis gave his farewell address in the U.S. Senate, he criticized the North for nullifying. So this is not some Confederate idea. Because of course, that's the worst thing you can accuse anybody of, is that. It's not a Southern idea, and it's not a Northern idea. It's an American idea that appeared all throughout the country in all regions for all different reasons. And it's something that I suggest it's worth reviving today. Now, what's the worst that could happen? It could fail. Well, you know what? So has everything else. Right? Everything else we've tried has failed. And, you know, I mean, I don't want to get political here, but there are still some people who think if I vote for some hand-picked candidate, hand-picked for me by the establishment, things will change. Yeah. You know what? How many times, I almost feel like I want the establishment candidate to win just so that 4 years from now I can say, now look, I told you this would happen, but yet the thing is that I've been doing this for years and it never seems to work. But enough of us are saying something's got to be done. Now, let me just briefly, because I'm we're over time, let me just briefly say, what are they going to say? What are they going to say? What are the arguments they're going to make? They're going to say this would be chaotic if the states nullified different laws, because some states would do one thing and other states would do another thing. You know what the correct answer to that is? So what? That's the United States of America. The states are going to be different from each other. So what? What about the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution? The Supremacy Clause does not say, this Constitution, plus laws which shall be made in pursuance thereof, plus many old laws we might want to pass, shall be the supreme law of the land. It does not say that. No one in his right mind would have ratified a Constitution that said that. So the issue is not the Supremacy Clause. The issue is this law pursuant to the Constitution? In which case it is the supreme law of the land, but that's the very question at issue. Now, I've talked in other talks, and we're sort of running out of time, about the issue of civil rights, because that does come up, and that's a legitimate question. But there you have a constitutional remedy in the enforcement of the 15th Amendment. And that, more than all the Supreme Court cases, solved all those problems. And at this point, so the southern states have seen black migration for 30 solid years. So this is not Birmingham 1963 anymore, and it's not fair to Southerners to keep insulting them all the time and treating them as the one group who can be attacked constantly. And I say that as a person who's spent most of my life in the North. I think it's about time we leave the South alone. I mean, I think they've been fairly honorable for a good long time. But let's also remember, what institution on earth has been the most lethal in history for racial minorities? Well, the modern centralized state. I mean, ask how the Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire were treated, or the Ukrainians in the Soviet Union, or the Asians in Uganda, or, of course, the Jews in Germany. How did they like political centralization? Did they think that it was really helping racial minorities there? Every tyrant who ever lived wants centralized power and despises the idea of nullification. And I know that when you talk about issues like this, somebody inevitably brings up Hitler. I'm sorry to have to be that person. But if you read Mein Kampf, which most of us, I don't think, are in the habit of doing, so I save you the trouble, in there is a bit on states' rights, and Hitler is dead set against it. And that should not be a head-scratcher. You know, he's Hitler, right? I mean, well, he doesn't want some state to be able to defy him. His whole fascist view is that the nation needs to speak with one voice. Well, that's not what the United States is. The United States was supposed to be something different among the nations. Because at the time the United States was being born, there was already a trend towards centralization, and it would accelerate in the 19th century with the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, centralization in Japan. It's going on everywhere. This idea that became mainstream in the West, that the only way you can organize political society is to have one irresistible power center ruling over a bunch of helpless individuals. But that wasn't the United States model. The United States looked to an older model, the older model in which Western liberty was born. The model in Europe, whereby You didn't just have one irresistible power center telling everybody else what to do. You had all these small little associations in society, churches and cities and towns and guilds and universities, and they all had their privileges and immunities. They all had their liberties that they were going to defend. And so there was no power in society that could demand that they all conform, because they were all ready to resist. They weren't just a bunch of isolated individuals. They had powers that came before the king's power. They had powers that came before the center's power, and that's how liberty came to Europe. Liberty came to Europe because after you got rid of the Roman Empire fell, there was no continent-wide empire that replaced it. What you had was a whole bunch of tiny little principalities. And when all the principalities are tiny, it conduces to liberty. Because if you oppress people, all they got to do is move 10 feet away. And that keeps the ambitions of princes limited. And so that's why it's important for us to remember, to think about, where is liberty most likely to be preserved today? Under one giant jurisdiction or under a multiplicity of competing jurisdictions? Well, we are taught not to think that way. We're taught to think the 19th century and late 18th century French revolutionary heresy of political centralization is the only way of organizing society. The United States was an experiment in saying no to that. Because the United States, if you look in the Constitution, is never once referred to in the singular. It's never referred to in the singular. It's always referred to in the plural. Because that's what we are. What makes us great is not that we're a great big country. The Soviet Union was a great big country. China under Mao was a great big country. And tens of millions of people died. That doesn't make you great. And there are tiny little places on the globe that are wonderful and great places to live. Renaissance Florence was a wonderful place to live. It's not the size. It's the fact that we're a collection of societies, that we haven't yielded everything to the center, that we have retained corporate bodies like states that have powers of resistance, but those powers have lain dormant for too long. And so now it is time, I suggest, that we have the political imagination, not, thank goodness, to have to think of something from scratch, but to have the presence of mind and the courage to look back to our own tradition and say, no, this is not the way we're supposed to live. We are not supposed to live with over 300 million people accepting the infallible judgments of some king. No, we are supposed to be a free people. The world is full of centralized states. Germany, France, England, everywhere. The world has enough of those. Let's be the exception. Let's be the exception for liberty and be the beacon to the world to reverse this trend and bring back both liberty and civilization to the United States and to the world. Thank you very much. All right, now for the fun stuff. Remember, Nullification, you can get the book at tomwoods.com/750, tomwoodsaudio.com for the free audiobook. But I want to, before I tell you some nice things about my little trip and about what's coming up on the show, I want to tell you about, this is a fantastic website that a show listener started, and I just want to read to you what he wrote about it. And the site is called medicalcompliancerx.com. So it appeals to only a sliver of the listeners, but most of you will nevertheless appreciate the spirit of what he's trying to do. He says it's a niche blog site targeting medical providers as potential clients for our online service. Our tool helps providers manage their regulatory compliance programs, which is a daunting task considering the enormous amount of regulation in healthcare. We work mostly with small to medium providers who are unable to afford costly consulting firms to manage their compliance like their larger competitors. My page provides compliance-related tips and information to help the little guys cope with the egregious amount of regulation imposed on them at the behest of the big guys. The independent medical practitioner is slowly becoming a thing of the past, with estimations that at the end of 2016, only 1 of 3 physicians' practices will remain independent. We want to help those who want to remain fight back. All right, excellent.
So the site is medicalcompliancerx.com. I'm going to link to it at tomwoods.com/750. Remember, you're a regular listener, you know my deal. You use my link to get your web hosting. I'll give you some publicity. I'll give you a link on my site, which will really give you some SEO juice. I'll admit you to my private bloggers group where you can get a lot of help from like-minded people. And I'll send you 24 video tutorials to help get you started. How do you get all these goodies? Check out tomwoods.com/publicity. I'm releasing this October 3rd, 2016. Bluehost is now taken to having somewhat regular sales. I'm not sure this is going to last much longer, but it's my job to tell you in advance before those sales come up because I have advance notice because I'm just that kind of guy. So tomorrow, October 4th, they're having a celebrate 13 years of Bluehost, or I don't know what it is, 13 or 9 or some number. It's not a round number. It's 13 or 9. For some reason, I can't remember which one it is. They're having a sale to celebrate that. $2.95 a month for your web hosting. So if you hear this in time, go grab it through tomwoods.com/publicity. All right. I went to Cambridge for the weekend for the Mises Circle in Boston. Had a tremendous time. Mark Thornton was there, Jeff Dice, Lou Rockwell, Ed Stringham, all of whom have been on the show. They all gave great talks. It was great speaking on the Harvard campus. I mean, come on. I was pretty pleased with my talk as well. I'll probably make that into an episode of the show next week. My talk was called The Bad News They Leave Out and the Good News They Leave Out. Now, how can you not want to listen to that? Come on now. So we had great fun. Then Lou Rockwell and I did an impromptu on-stage bantering session, followed by audience Q&A. So that was great. And then I gave a tour of the Harvard campus. It was overcast and it was misty a little bit, but we had a good time. I took people around, and I was just in my glory. It was so much fun to be back there, so great, so wonderful to get a cheeseburger sub over at Pinocchio's Pizza and to be waited on by the same guy who served me pizza 22 years earlier. Just great. Just what a great time I had. But then also, here's something that can improve your lives, folks. Here's something that can improve your lives. If you haven't tried an escape room yet, you've got to find one near where you live. I've now done 3 of them, all 3 in Boston. I took a bunch of supporting listeners of the show to escape rooms each night. Jeff Deist joined us one of the nights, the president of the Mises Institute. The object of an escape room is you have to escape the room. You're put in a room, you're locked in there for an hour, you got to figure out how to get out. And you got to solve puzzles and find clues, and you have to scour the room that you're in, and you try to get out, and there's a big clock counting down 60 minutes. There's a clue master watching who drops you appropriate clues at particular moments. It's great fun. So Friday night, September 30th, we did one of the rooms at Escape the Room Boston. You can visit it at escapetheroomboston.com. It's not an ad for them, by the way. I don't get any money. I love the place. So escapetheroomboston.com. I wouldn't do the apartment first. I do that one last. Maybe do the dig first. Anyway, we did the office one. We came so close. We were so close. We were just about to get the key to get out, and we ran out of time. So we lost. But the next night, I had a whole new... And it was great. We went out for a bite to eat afterward. We all had a great time. But the next night, we did the most recent one of their escape rooms, the Dig. And I don't want, if you're ever going to go there, I don't want to spoil it for you, but there were some surprises in that room. And it was fantastic. And we succeeded. We escaped the room, baby. We escaped. It was glorious. What a fantastic time. So I'm going to start going to escape rooms in Orlando, because that's where the closest ones to me are now. And I'm telling you, it's a fun thing for you to check out. So if you haven't done that, by all means, check that out. All right, finally, tomorrow I've got a guest coming on who has developed an app that you are just going to love. A lot of times, I think people overuse the expression when they see something great, they say, this could change the world. And you notice how it never does? The world is just the same as it used to be. I actually think this really could change the world. I'm just thrilled and delighted by it. That's all I'll say. So make sure and check out episode 751 of the show, and I'll see you then.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.